Welcome to the TeachML satellite event in 2022. I'm super happy to have Arturo here with our audience. Arturo was so kind as to present to us more details, context, and also potentially the way how you guys came about the fun MOOC about scikit-learn and how to use scikit-learn. Arturo did his PhD in physics at the Institute of Nuclear Sciences in Mexico, and he's currently working at the National Institute of Research in Digital Science and Technology, also known as INRIA, at least in my circles. INRIA is located in France, as part of the maintenance team of the machine learning library called scikit-learn, which potentially a lot of people have used already, and I am personally a big fan of. So Arturo, it's really a great pleasure to have you here. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me share my screen. In principle, you should be able to see my presentation. Yeah, slideshow. Excellent. So let's get started. First of all, I want to thank you, Peter, and the organizers for the invitation, for the opportunity of being here. As you already mentioned, my name is Arturo Amor, and today I will be presenting the scikit-learn MOOC. MOOC, by the way, stands for Multi-Online Open Course, for those who don't know. A word about me, as you already said, I did my PhD in physics at UNAM, which is the National University of Mexico. I have 10 years of teaching experience. Nowadays, I'm an active member of the scikit-learn consortium, and I am mostly focused on the documentation side of scikit-learn. Nowadays, I'm also in charge of the machine learning in Python with scikit-learn MOOC, aka the scikit-learn MOOC for the friends. You can find me in my social networks as Arturo Amor Q, well, on Twitter, and that's also my username for GitHub if you want to look at what I'm currently doing. So the outline of the talk is first I'm going to give a brief overview of the MOOC, and then I will speak about some numbers of the previous sessions that we have had. Then I will present the MOOC material as teaching support material. And finally, I will present some of the technical and pedagogical choices that we have made during the development of the contents. So let's do it. If I had 1 second to convince you on why to take the MOOC, I would say it's because it's free. And if I had 2 seconds to convince you, I would also add that you can do it at your own pace. It's designed, it will be open for 13 weeks, and that means that you can completely in a pace of approximately 3 hours per week, but you can adapt yourself if you want to invest more time in completing it. You can probably do it in less time. Also, there's nothing to install. And most importantly, it's open source, which means everybody has a voice and you can help improve the contents if you feel like doing so. So here, just a small parenthesis, FON is the French platform. FON stands for France Université Numérique, but the contents are in English, actually. So the idea is that everybody can access to the contents whenever they want. And what are the goals of the MOOC? As we know, the machine learning is becoming more and more, used by all kind of users. It's fashionable. It's good. It helps people getting things done. So we are a growing community, and not necessarily all the persons who join the community have a strong mathematical background or a statistical background. And because of that, we want to start from the very fundamental concepts of machine learning in the very first module, and then you can actually start building your own predictive model using the tools that we provide in scikit-learn. And at this stage, you can build a model, but use it like a bit of a black box. You don't really understand the models themselves, at least not in the narrative we intended to, because we want people to get their hands on since the beginning and create a pipeline. And then afterwards, you get to develop the intuitions behind the machine learning models without really going into the details of the algorithms themselves. So we try to send the message during the whole course that evaluating the statistical performance is really important. It's the basis of machine learning. So one thing that is noticeable from the MOOC and that defines us is that it's a MOOC designed by the scikit-learn core developers themselves. This means that it's up to date with the latest release of the library, and that you can actually see what's going on in the latest versions. So it's a good way to keep up to date on what you can do. And we also give live support or live-ish support in the forum. Okay, we also have a certification mechanism. The certificates are issued by phone upon successful completion of the MOOC, which means you have to answer quizzes and programming exercise, and if you get the 60% of good score, then you get a certificate. And this is also something to emphasize. It's free certification. Also, we don't ask but minimal prerequisites. For instance, we recommend some experience with NumPy, Pandas, and Matplotlib, but it's only recommended as you may learn how to use them on the fly. If you have already some basic knowledge on them, it's good enough. What we really require is knowledge on Python programming, for instance, defining variables, writing functions, etc. Not even classes, it's quite basic. So we really encourage people to join even if they feel like their knowledge of Python programming is quite basic. Okay, so we have a hands-on philosophy, which means we have in practice 7 modules plus 1 introductory module, also 15 video lessons, but our emphasis is actually on the 70 programming notebooks plus 21 exercises. So that you can really get your hands on programming and doing machine learning pipelines your own. And this is the Bay West of learning. It's not static. You really get to make things on your own. And you also have the quizzes and wrap-up quizzes to evaluate your progress and your understanding of the materials. Okay, so a question that I get really often is, but what if I already know everything about machine learning? Why would I follow your MOOC? And to answer this, I want to recall this tweet from 2019, where this person says that by default, the scikit-learn, the logistic regression in scikit-learn uses a non-zero value for the regularization, and that people may not be really aware that they are using a regularization. So the answer here is, even if you already know everything about machine learning, we also try to pass some good practices during the MOOC. For instance, that you really have to tune all of your hyperparameters, in particular the regularization of the logistic regression, if you want to have a valuable model that can be set into production. So this is in particular mentioned in the module 3. Here you have the whole outline of the 7 modules plus an introductory one. Remember that the first modules are relatively simple, so if you feel like you can go through them quickly and prefer to get things done in this side, feel free to do so. You really have artistic liberty. Okay, let's now talk about the MOOC in some numbers. These are numbers recalled from both sessions, but most emphasis in session 2, and I want to emphasize that the contents are in English because the target is everybody in the world who can join. So here we, in the last few sessions, we had 12,000 enrollments per session coming from 141 countries. Most of them coming from France or Spanish or French-speaking countries, but also a huge representation from the Americas and India. And mainly we have male audience. We want to bring more balance to these numbers by making a better communication for the following sessions. And something that you can also notice is that the population is between 26 and 35 years old, but we also have a good share of people that is probably changing careers between 36 and 45 years old. And people that is in their younger, let's say, making a bachelor possibly, or somewhat higher studies. Most of the people, by the way, have a high education on STEM careers, notably the computer science, statistics, physics, mathematics. The grand majority has a master or equivalent, but also we even have people with a PhD, and a big share of all of them have at least a bachelor or equivalent. So as I was saying, the first modules try to set the ground floor for everybody, and so that people, even if they don't have a huge background in these careers, they can join and jump in the MOOC. You can even notice that we have people from environmental sciences and even humanities. And that's why we try to be as inclusive as possible to everybody, from regardless of their background. Something also that we can notice from the statistics we obtained in the last session is that almost half of the people that started the MOOC dropped out during the first module, but then those who survived the first module also finished, around the half of them finished until the 7th module. This means at the end of the day that maybe 1/4 of the people who started the MOOC gets to finish it. Okay, so we also have a consistent use of the forum. We have a minimum in the middle, but it never reaches 0. We have at least one post every single day, even during the weekends. And we have peaks during the beginning and the end of the session. This is because here people get to introduce themselves in a post, and here people has the opportunity to give feedback and comment on the conclusions. But this activity in the forum means on our side that we have to give a consistent support of the forum. Me personally, I have spent approximately one complete day, reviewing and answering posts in the forum, but you can see that my colleagues are also quite involved in doing so. You can play with these numbers and see that how much time it takes for one person to answer one post. Well, it depends on the person, but you can really see here that we have a real investment on answering the questions. We also want to think that we were more successful in session 2 with respect to session 1 in blue, because in the first session we had a passing threshold of 50% of the score of good answers to issue the certificate. And even though we raised this passing threshold in the second session, we still had more certificates that were issued. This is partly because we had more people inscribed or active in the second session, but we also like to think that it's because we did a good job improving the contents between session 1 and session 2. This reflects in satisfied users. At the end of the MOOC, you have a survey where people said that they were satisfied or even extremely satisfied about the MOOC, and that it was completely worth the time they invested in doing so. Let's be honest, the survey is at the end of the MOOC, so maybe not everybody answered the MOOC, answered the survey, because they probably maybe didn't survive. But this already mentions that people that were not satisfied were also not willing to give negative feedback, which is at least relatively good. But let's keep in mind that satisfied users are humans and not numbers. We have had a lot of positive feedback in the forum. In general, we think that the forum is quite positive. We have very machine learning oriented questions, not only technical questions, but people really want to go further and understand maybe details or going further in the contents. I also want to bring your attention to this particular post because also trainers have shown the appreciation for the quality of our material. And this brings us to the next part of the talk, which is the MOOC as teaching support. So far, we have been talking about the fun session, the one that is hosted by this French platform, Fun. But we also have a static version that if you follow this link here, you can use the materials that are open the whole year. Remember that the Fun session is only for 3 weeks, but the static version is there all the time, 24/7. The 365 days of the year. Okay, let's have a demo time. Please let me know if I managed to change my... how do I do this? How do I change the share screen? I think I have to stop it, right? Okay, here it is. This is the main web site that we have for the MOOC. It's made in Jupyter. It's a JupyterBook, and well, you can see from the very beginning the course presentation. Here you have a link to enroll to the next Fun session, and you have some material if you want to learn a bit more about NumPy, Pandas, or Matplotlib before starting the MOOC itself. And you also have some links to the social networks and even the YouTube playlist for the channel. Here to the left, you have a table of contents where you can navigate through the material. And for instance, if you click here, you can see what is contained in this module. You can go to the first notebook. And you can notice also that you have here some icons. This one is for downloading the materials, the script as a Python file or as a PDF. This one is a direct link to our repo, our GitHub repo, where you can open an issue, and you can also suggest an edit in the same interface. This is the full screen mode. You can use it when teaching. And here you have a binder icon that is really useful when you are using the materials for teaching. You can click on it. Wait, maybe before talking about that, I want to show you that at the end, you can scroll and you always have the progression here, and so that you don't have to go to the table of contents, but directly access the next exercise or next book. And here it is important to use the binder because you can use the exercise to make people wake up and do something with their hands and get their hands into the code and not follow only a static version of the MOOC, but they also get to write something. At the beginning, we only ask for simple things such as loading a data frame and exploring the data, but it escalates and it becomes more interesting afterwards. So now let's try the binder. And in the meantime, I will take some water. It takes a few minutes to load the first time, but afterwards it's really fast, as you may see. So this is really useful when you are trying to give a live demo, because sometimes you spend a lot of time helping people set up their environment, their working environment, and sometimes environments can be tricky. For instance, they may depend on the operating system or some other things that you don't really have to deal with if you use the binder. So I really think it's worth using instead of asking people to make a fork or run locally the books. Yeah, and it's much better than just having a static version where you just scroll and it's like modern slides. So yeah, probably you already know the binder utility. It's really useful. And we encourage people to try to answer the exercises themselves, but in the case that you get stuck with some of the content, we also provide the solution for the exercises, and sometimes even we try to go further in the contents during the solution. So even if you already answered the exercise, it's worth taking a look at the suggested solution. Okay, so also you can take a look at the quizzes that we provide. For instance, here, when I'm using this for live session, I usually ask people like, I mean, in person, you say like, okay, now who thinks A is the right answer? Raise your hands or clap your hands if you may. But this brings a bit more, and it makes the contents more dynamic. So you get the attention of the people back, and it's something more interactive between the both sides. So, yeah, of course, you can cherry pick which questions are more important for you. And the main difference between the static version, by the way, and the live session is that here we don't provide the answers to the questions, because if we did so, it will be too easy for people following the MOOC in the fun version, and then giving a certificate will be too free, too easy. So that's why we cannot give the answers, but at least we decided to mention that you can have either one or more answers that apply, and keep in mind that maybe one there's only one single correct answer, but when definitely it's just a single answer, we also mention this. Okay. You also have some videos in the whole progression of the MOOC. We personally don't play them when we are demoing. What we rather suggest is using the slides that are here. If you click on them, you can use the arrows in your keyboard to navigate through them, and you can somehow follow the ideas that we present here. You can skip them also. You have the freedom to do so if you want to. You can also improvise different kind of explanations or extend it as you may. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation. Okay. So, as I was trying to emphasize, you have artistic freedom as a teacher. You can adapt the contents by the level of your audience, depending if they are more on the beginner side. You can really get the progression from the very basics, as I said, from loading a data frame, or you can skip the contents in the first modules and then go directly to building pipelines, or I don't know. You get the freedom to do whatever you want. You can also extend explanations if you feel like doing so, using the Blackboard or extra material. That's in live sessions. But if you are in video conference or in hybrid, you can also use different kinds of online material, for instance, notepads to create some comments, notes, encourage people to use them, to ask questions, to answer the quizzes, by the way, or simply give feedback to the other participants to communicate by using them. So also the progress is only a recommendation. You can as well start by showing the models and not by starting building the pipeline as we do. This choice we did was because we wanted people to get involved into the actual making of a pipeline, so that they will get encouraged of getting some results, even if at the beginning it's sort of a black box, the algorithm itself. But feel free to use a different progression than the one that we explain here. And this brings us to our personal, technical, and pedagogical choices that we made during the development of the course. And I would argue that in general, when you are telling a story, it's better to keep some sort of linearity. You have a beginning, a middle, and the end. So in machine learning, in principle, mostly it's not that easy, because you get some concepts that are very intertwined between them. They have interactions, so it's not easy to have a linear story. Sometimes you have to introduce a new concept and then go back to the main narrative of the course, and this is perfectly fine. You can do it as many times as you want. You can have interpolations, as long as you keep a main narrative that is underlying in the progression. Okay, what we try to avoid in general is having this kind of what would be like narrative Feynman diagrams. Sorry, I'm a physicist, I had to make this joke. But what I mean in practice is that you have to avoid these interactions between going back and forth between the contents. It's really not nice when you have people that are explaining something and then they say like, yeah, but wait, 5 slides ago I had to mention this, which connects to the next step, because 3 slides ago I forgot to mention that. You know, it's distracting. So it's better to keep things as linear as possible. And what does this mean in practice for the MOOC? It means, for instance, the concept of train test split, which is possibly, I'm going to demo the linearity of the narrative by using this concept, which is probably the most used tool in scikit-learn, which is the train test split. And you probably already know that if you have, let's say, 50 samples, you can use 40 of them for training the model and then 10 of them for testing. And now that you or people are familiar with the concept of a train test split, you can go further and say like, okay, but this will give you just one score. If you make some cross-validation, you will get, for instance, here in a 5-fold cross-val, you will get 5 different scores, and this will be more systematic because it will give you a notion of the variance in the scores that your model can provide depending on the data it is trained and tested on. So it's pretty much the same concept here. It's just that you can visually see that you are just iterating which subset of the data is being used for training and which one is used for testing. And now that you have this concept really clear, then you can go further and understand the concept of trained validation test split, which is quite similar to this trained test split, but inside the training samples, you can make an extra split that is really similar to this cross validation, but you will use for tuning the hyperparameters. Okay, so notice that here the testing samples are fixed, which is pretty much what we had here. But now that you have grasped these three concepts, you can use this as basis for something that is way more complex. Even visually, you can see that this is harder to grasp if you don't have this solid basis. Basically, what we are doing here is the same thing, but you are iterating once again the testing samples so that you can assess the you don't only get to tune the hyperparameters, but also assess the generalization performance of the model. And now this is something that we try to improve in the narrative of the session too, because sometimes we were passing a bit back and forth, and these two concepts here were not solid enough to build these two other concepts afterwards. And this is something that I believe it's better in the session too. Another thing that happened, speaking about linearity in this particular example, in session 1 we had a narrative where in the first module you had a machine learning pipeline, and then you use a trained test split to validate it. Then we introduced the concept of cross-validation for getting the variance of these scores, and of course that means that you have score distributions. So we introduce them and we say, okay, now you have a mean accuracy, for instance, or a mean score, and then you have a variance, a confidence interval, or different notions of not a single value to assess the performance of your model, but a confidence interval. But in the original narrative, we also had missing values. And the problem with that was that if we wanted to introduce missing values, that means we had to introduce inputting techniques, which themselves are embedded in a machine learning pipeline that you feed to the trained test or the cross-validation. And for instance, something that happened a lot in the forum is that people were asking, what kind of a strategy do you use for inputting? And that brings us to the concept of data distributions, because if you want to impute values, then they have to follow more or less the same distribution as the original samples. So it was really complex, because this also translated to score distributions. They get more broad, more variability if you add more complexity to your model. So what we decided to do for session 2 is just, unfortunately, we had to get rid of all of this to ease the narrative and only have something that is more linear. Actually, we still have a video that shows inputting, but just a video, and this is not being taken into account for scoring the performance of the student. And now I think it's easier to focus the attention on the good practices of evaluation without necessarily getting into the details of how to build a more complex pipeline. Another decision that we had to make was to ask people how to compare different models. Now that we know that we have distributions of the scores, we want to really understand if a model is better than another one. And for doing so, I'm using the statistical comparison, well, this example that appears in the example gallery of the documentation in scikit-learn, where what we show is that building this classification task, where the idea or the goal is to differentiate blue samples from orange samples, and you can try 4 different models: a linear, a polynomial, and an RBF kernel. Okay, so now that you understand the problem, you can fit these different models and try to see which one is the best. What we have in practice are distributions of the scores. For instance, during the RBF kernel seems to have a good accuracy that is compatible with 100% accuracy. But you can really see that these two models, the linear kernel is also good enough in catching the same score, the same accuracy. So now you can really get a notion of what is best in the sense of, is this model best than this one? Well, it's hard to tell. So we define best as being far enough, meaning beyond one standard deviation, or, well, this is not standard deviation because it's a box plot, but anyway, if they are differentiable by a given distance. For instance, this, you can see that it performs a bit less. Yeah, probably this model is actually not that good, but between these two models is easier to see that they are comparable. So for the session 2, what we decided is to change the notion of how to compare models. What we are asking in session 2 to the students is to compare models fold-wise. For instance, is the second-degree polynomial better than the three-degree polynomial in most of the folds? So the answer is yes, because here you can see that systematically the purple curve is below the other curves, corresponding to this spread notion of the this spread distribution of the scores. It might be counterintuitive that we decided to change this plot that looks really simple also to the interpretation to this one for session 2, because what we actually faced is that if you wanted to score, to evaluate the student, you could have like a binning of, let's say, answer A. Is the model accuracy between 0.8 and 1 for this model? And then there was a chance that the students were having a setup that was just giving points here. And it was not robust enough to this kind of difference in the setting and the training. Just because of the high variance of some of the models that could be due to the model itself or to the data that we used. So we thought that, we didn't think. It is a fact that this is more robust in the sense that you can get to compare fold to fold and see, like in the most of the folds, one model outperforms another one. Okay, so another decision that we made for the session 3 is to add conclusions. In the session 1, we had a hard cutoff after the module 7, after the wrap-up quiz that is one of the hardest, and you didn't have a notion of or a sensation of closure. So now we decided to add to the friendliness of the MOOC by adding a set of conclusions to pass the big messages of the MOOC, meaning a wrap-up of the material. We also introduce some useful links to extra material for people that want to go further with machine learning beyond the materials we provide in the MOOC. For instance, in the static version of the MOOC, we have a module that is not published in the font version, but you can see it if you feel like doing so, but it's not being evaluated. That's the difference. And we try to also wrap up the values that we want to share. For instance, that models have a societal impact when they are set into production. Sometimes the impact is low, but sometimes it can really affect lives. So it's important to have a compromise with the work that we are doing when joining machine learning, because doing machine learning is just a small part of the pipeline of decision making, for instance, and you really have to be careful with the interpretation of the data. And if you arrive to the end of the MOOC, I think it's really worth seeing the video by Gael, where he explains all of these concepts, and it's really encouraging. It's worth the whole MOOC, just this only video. And finally, what do we expect from session 3? You can expect that we have made some small fixes with respect to session 2. The contents have not changed a lot, but we used some of the feedback we received in the forum for the session 2 to improve the quality for the incoming session. And you can also expect that you will have the same forum support as continuous as possible from our side. We usually try to respond all the single posts, every single post in the forum, and it takes us between 1 and 2 days, depending. Sometimes if it's a weekend, maybe a little bit more, but we are quite responsive in the forum. So finally, you can have a voice in these decisions that I presented that we could potentially be implemented in session 3. If you think you can improve the contents or join a discussion, please feel free to do so. You can try to tackle some issues, maybe not the issues that involve videos, but we have some issues that can be easily fixed if you feel like doing so. You can submit a PR. I think we are a very welcoming community. And if you want to join us but not necessarily have a voice, you can always give us a star, a fork, or feel free to be part of this community. So if you are not still a part of the community, in the name of the teachers and the pedagogical and technical team, we say that we are waiting for you, and we still have a very nice surprise for the end, for the great end. And it's that you can sign up today to the next session of the MOOC on the Fun platform by following this QR. It will start on October 18 and it will end 13 weeks afterwards in the 17th of January. So if the QR doesn't work for any particular reason, you can always Google scikit-learn MOOC, and I can assure you that the first option will be the Fun platform. And please join the community. You will like it. So that's for me. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Okay, let's see what we have here.
Okay, good. Yeah, took a while here. Thank you for this nice presentation. This was really wonderful, I thought. I actually took the liberty and posted some links that Katie suggested in the chat already. I see that she already posted another one. Okay, I'll add that later on, or somebody does that for me. So there are two questions. Those are two that I actually put down. I invite everyone to chime in if you want and ask more questions. Okay, so first question I have, even though you showed the statistics for it, when I personally hear MOOCs or MOOCs, or we have some debate how to pronounce that. Anyway, I immediately think about dropout rates. So there is some evidence that learners tend to not complete MOOCs, and you showed that, right? I mean, you remember that survival plot effectively, as you called it. But I really would love to ask you, is that completion rate any of your concern? Meaning that you guys invest human resources into this MOOC, right? And you have a mandate to do so. So what would be a dropout rate where you say, no, we're going to stop this here, or is there some limit to the participation number, maybe to turn around the question, a limit to the participation number in terms of the infrastructure that is available. So, you know, there's always two sides of this to this completion rate thingy, right? If you have too many participants, maybe your infrastructure is not fit for it. I mean, you mentioned 12K learners. That's a lot. That's really a lot.
Yes.
And so yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, one question at a time. So, yes, it is part of our concern. I think at the end of the day, the issue is trying to compete for the attention of the people that is completing a MOOC and try to keep them motivated. So we try to tackle this by trying to improve the friendliness of the MOOC. For instance, we think that videos help in making it more dynamical and to actually give a face to the person that you are somewhat interacting with. So, for instance, if you have just code and code and code that you get to run, it's more likely that you will get discouraged. We have also some issues in the GitHub. I think there's one recent issue where we say that maybe we can add some encouraging words at the end of the session one, saying like, okay, you invested a lot of time in this module. Be aware that maybe as a beginner, it may take more time to complete it than the following chapters or something like this. So it's something that we have in mind and we really care about, and we are doing our best to diminish the dropout rate. Of course, it's normal to have it and it's impossible to eradicate it completely, but we are doing our best. Also, in terms of numbers of participants, yes, we have a lot of participants, 12K, as you said, it's really a huge number. For the moment, we have a partner who is providing the cloud computing and enough power for hosting this big amount of people. And the last time they even gave away some vouchers for cloud computing at the end of the MOOC. So this could also be encouraging to follow this third session. I'm not saying that we will do the same for the third one, but this partner is really supportive with us. So I think that answers the questions, or or there was something else that you said?
No, totally fine, totally fine. I meandered my way a little bit into the questions there. Okay, next thing. The MOOC itself comprises several data sets for demoing machine learning methods. How did you pick those data sets?
Good question. Okay. Honestly, I was not here for session one. I was hired for session two, so I was not there in the discussions. As far as I'm concerned, I think the decisions were made to keep data simple, I would say, toy data sets. And also something that balanced the decision is that they are stable enough. As I was mentioning, sometimes if you have a lot of missing values or different kind of things, will be a source of variance, and you rather have something that helps with the reproducibility from the user side. So that was also a matter of weight. But once again, in the GitHub, we have an issue saying that we are open to have more realistic data sets if there is a place where you think it can fit. Feel free to do so. Maybe we will improve it. I mean, we are sort of running short of time for the session 3, so maybe a huge change as introducing a new dataset. It's complicated by now, but there's still room for adding more realistic datasets if you feel like doing so. Because also it has been discussed that this can be encouraging for people to avoid the dropout. If you have realistic problems, maybe somebody will say like, oh, of course, this interests me. This is I am personally attached to the problem they are solving because it's related to what I do or what I want to do. And in this case, it will be much better to use a realistic data set, but that it's simple enough to keep these properties that I mentioned. By the way, we have a place where we need to show that scaling is important, scaling of the data, to have everything in the same order of magnitude. And I think this is something that really has to be fixed in the next few days. So if you have any feedback on which kind of data set can be used for doing so, this is an opportunity to use something more realistic.
No, so what straight comes to my mind is that this is exactly a discussion point that in my circles comes up a lot of times, and nobody really has a good recipe based on what data set to pick, because the data set itself imposes cognitive load on the learner. If you pick something too special to a domain, basically there's a high likelihood that people just say, I have no idea about particles in particle physics, so I don't understand anything.
Sure.
Right. So, and this is a totally valid concern from my point of view. That's why I was wondering.
Yeah. But for instance, I would argue that classifying penguins is something that even non-biologist people can
of course.
do. But
of course.
The downside is that maybe you don't get that involved, really, like, oh, my life dream is to classify penguins.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
Another question there. Discussing content is adding reinforcement of this content tremendously for learning. The FunMOOC mainly has the forum to foster discussions.
Yes.
Did you undertake long-term learning assessments to see if higher engagement in the forums inflicts better or sustained understanding?
That's a good question. I'm afraid we don't have long-term assessments. We only want to pass the basics of the how-to, but yeah, keeping track of 12K people, well, 1/4 of 12K is still complicated.
I personally totally understand.
We do encourage people to contribute, for instance, and if we see them afterwards on the GitHub, or either if it's on the MOOC or actually on scikit-learn, it's always a way to keep track on successful users that got engaged. But it's really the exception, not the law.
Yeah, I totally understand. From my point of view, if you give a semester-long course, you're in a similar situation, right? Typically, there's an examination at the end, and then people leave. There's typically quite a discussion about more remote or digital ways of learning and how sustained they basically are capable of transferring the knowledge from authors or speakers, in your case, to the students. And therefore, these more, what is long-term, right? Half a year or so?
Yeah,
that's of course the next question. I know that in the carpentries, there's an automated long-term assessment going on with learners of the mainline curricula, which is basically, the carpentries has the infrastructure for this by good measure of their learner database. So they basically get in touch with the learners, and then of course you have some ratio of learners that actually take part in this long-term assessment. And
yes,
I don't remember the exact numbers, but some people simply don't reply to this. But it's quite interesting to really see a long-term and lasting effect if it's there.
If I have a heartwarming experience, is that some people have contacted me on LinkedIn to say, for instance, thank you, I got the job position after completing the MOOC. This is already something that fulfills the spirit, and some other people that have encouraged us to translating the contents, for instance. I have been asked if it's possible. This is also, by the way, a discussion. We have the contents in English because most of the contents, even in the documentation itself, is in English. So this is already a bottleneck for people who want to get in machine learning but don't necessarily speak the language. But we try to encourage people for instance, from Spanish-speaking countries such as mine. To use worst case scenarios, some Google Translate or DeepL or whatever tool they prefer to look for the words, but I mean, it takes some extra effort to do so, but still I mean at least we added some subtitles to the videos, for instance, so that people can also copy paste them into something to translate them. It's been on a discussion also if we want to make it available in more languages. It's something that is hard to maintain, and yes, I know it's a bottleneck, but it will be very good to support this for being more open to all kind of users.
Cool. Thank you very much, Arturo. Last chance for one last question before we move on, and happily welcome Lorena. Are there any parting thoughts or questions to Arturo? That apparently is not the case. There's still the opportunity to contribute any thoughts or questions to the notes. Feel free to do that. And with that, I'll stop the recording at this point.
Thank you.